I know of cases earlier, well, shortly after the Public Order Act, where one protest of Just Stop Oil protesters was slow walking over Lambeth Bridge. And within 10 minutes, there was an additional condition added to the protest using the new law under the Public Order Act, is Section 12 condition, and that's one of the ones that's been declared unlawful. And then there was, within 15 minutes, arrests made. And the inconvenience, the disruption caused, according to what I've seen, probably was in the range of about 5 minutes inconvenience to traffic. There was a lane for emergency vehicles to pass, and this was not an extensive blockade. So already there are concerns about proportionality, whether enforcement should have happened so quickly in those cases, and those cases are going through the magistrates' courts currently, and as far as I understand it, many of them currently have resulted in not guilty verdicts. So just to summarise that, I am concerned that there's a move towards quick enforcement, which there shouldn't be. Enforcement should be a last resort when people are exercising the rights to protest. And I really go back to not only the common law right and the importance of the common law right in our country, in our jurisdiction, but also the rights that arose and came under the European Convention of Human Rights, which came out of, obviously, the atrocities in World War II. And protest is a cornerstone of democracy. So I am concerned about enforcement perhaps being too quick currently.
OK, thank you. Matt, the same question. How do you think the Met have dealt with this?
Well, those of you who've heard me here before, formally or informally, will know that I'm not slow to criticise the Met when I think they're getting things wrong. Like all organisations, big organisations, they're never consistently good or consistently bad at what they do. And whereas the Met's got a lot of shortcomings, I would say public order is one of the things it actually does very well. I've spent a lot of time with their public order commanders, and indeed officers on the front line, and I've done similar in other parts of the country. And I would say the level of expertise and experience in policing in the Met is on a different level to most, if not all, other forces around the country, largely because they get so much practice and the demands on them are significantly greater than they are elsewhere. So with a sort of military background and with quite a lot of experience in running high-risk operations, I would say that the Met's command and control of public order problems in the capital, by and large, and particularly around the government control zone in central London, is very good. And they've got some very experienced people. Unlike other parts of the country, they've got people for whom being good at public order is almost a full-time job. So there's a lot of experience and a lot of expertise and a lot of good advice available to the people that are running operations in central London. It is worth noticing that as far as I'm aware, no doubt we'll talk about some of the other controversies that the demonstrations in central London over the last 12 months have caused, but there doesn't... if there has been any serious injury or serious criminal damage to anything, I am not aware of it. And so the Met have taken head-on the most serious risk of that and actually dealt with it very well, is my view. However, I think some of the way that it has been portrayed, and it is incredibly difficult, the thing about protest policing is that you're never going to get praised for your response. If people agree with the aim of the protest, they will resent and find themselves in opposition to the way it's policed. If they're anti, if it's policed rigorously, they're going to be objecting. If they don't agree with the aim of the protest, they're going to inevitably think that the policing of it was too lenient. So you get this kind of, unlike a murder, I know this is a false comparison, but unlike a murder where if the perpetrator is identified and prosecuted, everybody's going to approve of what the police have done, they're never going to get universal approval for almost anything which is public order or protest related. Having taken that into account, I think that the Met are open to criticism for being slow to explain some of their actions and not proactive in educating the public about the challenges they face and why they behave the way they do. But if you ask the basic question of have they done a decent job with the protesting over last year, my answer is yes, I think.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's good to have slightly differing views because we only learn when we hear different people's views, in my opinion. Lord Warney, thank you so much.
I think fair to say, Kirsty and I are not going to agree about where the balance of competing rights sits. We both, I think, will agree that there is a balance to be struck. I think where that balance should lie is probably the point of difference between your members of the panel.
Yeah, and I suspect most of the public. Lord Warney, thank you so much for coming. I'm going to ask you the questions I've asked our other two guests. If you could just give us a brief comment on them and then we'll proceed. So the Met has described the period since 7th of October 2023 as, and I'm quoting, the greatest period of sustained pressure on the Met since the Olympics in 2012. Do you agree with this statement? And in your opinion, how well has the Met dealt with the level of regular large-scale protests since the 7th of October?
Well, Madam Chair Committee, first of all, many apologies for being late. It's entirely an error on my part. I thought you were starting at 10:30 and there was no reason for me to think that because you had been quite clear that you were starting at 10. So
don't worry.
I'll try and talk fast to make up for it. On the first question, yes, I think it is quite clear that the level of strain that's on the Metropolitan Police as a result of primarily as a result of the weekly drumbeat of protests, as was on the Gaza issue, has placed a huge strain on the force, and that has ratcheted up into many tens of millions of pounds and thousands of rest days, which ultimately have to be paid back. And I have sympathy for the leadership of the Metropolitan Police, who are juggling all of the policing priorities that are set for them by political leaders and the public, and are operating within a framework at present where there can be the strain on their resources cannot in any way be taken into account in managing the level of demand for protests. So if an organisation or organisations wish to stage a weekly or even daily, but however frequent a large-scale protest, they are obliged to agree to that and to police it. And my concern has been, in looking at this in my role as the government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption, is that ultimately that will either have to be met by significantly increased resources from central government at a time when resources are clearly sparse, or frontline policing priorities will suffer. And so it has been one of the recommendations in my recent review to the government, which was published, as it turned out, 24 hours before the election was called and is now being considered by the new government, is either for some method of contribution towards the cost of policing protests for particular organisations who choose to have large-scale repeat demonstrations, or for the police to be able to factor in the cost of resourcing and the cost of other frontline policing areas when making decisions on whether a particular march can go ahead in a particular way at a particular time. They have no authority to do that at the moment, and that for me is a gap. On the second issue of how well they've done, I think, like Matt Parr, and forgive me for having missed your contribution yesterday, I have a real level of sympathy for the difficulty of the task that the Met has to do, given the circumstances. I think that the charge of two-tier policing, as it is commonly understood, is not correct. I don't believe that anyone in the Met or leadership goes in consciously, or I think largely, either consciously or subconsciously, largely, and wishes to treat different protests in different ways. Nevertheless, I have been really concerned with the level of criminality that has been on display in protests, and the evident difficulty that police officers have in being able to charge all of that criminality, even when it is readily in evidence at times on social media. Now, some of that, I think, is inevitable. The police cannot be everywhere, and I think the police leadership have pointed out examples where provocative imagery may have been shown in amidst a crowd momentarily, and a photo taken for social media and then vanished. Nevertheless, there are also incidents where, and I think you can look at this last weekend, where there were banners on display in clear support of a proscribed terrorist organisation, Hezbollah, committed to the violent eradication of Israel, which is in clear contravention to the law, which were not picked up at the time. And that goes into a question of policing tactics, where the police rightly point out that they have a responsibility to maintain public order, and that in some circumstances you will have that action which they might otherwise want to take may result in a hostile situation being exacerbated. I can understand the line of that argument, but it does create an issue where some of these clear offences are not being immediately brought to justice in the way that we would all like to see.
Okay, thank you. We're actually going to go into some of these issues slightly more in some of the additional questions. But now I'll hand over to Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, panel. Lord Warnley, just touching on this business of asking protest organisers to make a financial contribution to the cost of police and protests, how would government avoid stifling freedom of expression and right of lawful assembly as set out in the Human Rights Act?
Yeah.
1998, if organisers had to stump up some cash to pay for the protests themselves?
It's a really important question, and I think my proposal has sometimes been mischaracterised by a kind of pay to protest automatically, and that's absolutely not how anything could work. And in my mind, and look, this is not a straightforward proposal, I'll grant you, but in my mind, it could be appropriate to ask larger organisations to make a contribution in circumstances where they are choosing the method of repeat mass demonstrations over a period of time, like you have seen in the others. So the question of a single organisation wanting to protest, I think there would be no question. I don't think there would be any support really for doing that. But ultimately, I think it's important for people to bear in mind that in this liberal democracy in which we are blessed to live in this country, there are many ways in which it is possible to get your point of view across, many channels to do that. And mass demonstrations turning up in a particular place at a particular time is only one way of doing that. And if an organisation chooses that particular method, week after week after week, and you can see the strain which it is putting on other policing areas. Of course, in an ideal world, all of these costs would be met somewhere else, but we are demonstrably not in a world where there is ideal resources, and you are having to weigh up cuts to other frontline areas to carry on policing.
If I may, just one further check. Are we not running the risk, though, of it being those with the deepest pockets, those who can be externally funded, possibly by dark money, can simply apply time and time and time and time again and say, I'm doing this within the letter of the regulations. I can afford to pay, therefore I'd like to do this every week. And there's no audit trail. There's no real question about where, real knowledge of where the money's coming from, unless you're going to create a whole new mechanism for auditing the organisations to find out precisely who's funding those campaigns. It's privatisation of the protest, surely.
I don't accept that, but I think in any circumstances where you're asking for a contribution, then issues of affordability can apply. I think that's why it's really important that if you brought in such a proposal, you would set it at a level that was not in any way stifling organisations with smaller levels of resources or who wanted to make occasional protests. But I suppose I would put the question back to lawmakers of what is the alternative in this current situation. Now, I think one other alternative is another of my recommendations, is that you allow the police to factor in when their resources are. If you don't want to have any kind of charging mechanism, and I understand where there could be reticence to do that, but if not, then it seems to me you are left with a choice of either an ever greater funding from the public purse for these protests. People can make that argument, but at a time when money is tight, I think you have to be clear that that will mean a particular pot of money coming from central government in perpetuity to fund this particular activity, or you give the police the ability to say, actually, for example, you've been in central London twice already this month. For this third and fourth one that you want, there is now our resources are so thin in the lack of police who need days off, who need rest time, that we can't do this without cutting other areas, and therefore kind of give it a rest for a week. Or you accept that policing protests is effectively going to have a higher priority than other areas of policing, say, of all of the other ways, and you're finding other areas to cut that you would not want to do, and that seems to me to be a really difficult situation.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Kirsty, I can see you need a charger. If you lift that slap up, there's a plug.
Thank you very much.
Jeanette's going to help you. There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll move over to Assembly Member Desai.
Before we just go, can I just...
Yes, of course. That microphone,
So,
please.
good morning, panel. In terms of asking organizations that organize protests on a very regular basis over a period of time, and asking them to contribute towards their share of the policing costs. I see the logic of what you're saying, but I'm thinking about the practicality. So, I mean, let's look at what's been happening over the last year. The organization that has been calling the marches on a more or less regular basis for the last year has been the President's Solidarity Campaign. Now, take a scenario where the organization...
Who are very heavily funded by trade unions in Britain, it's worth pointing out.
Okay. Leaving that aside, although I think we're talking of the cost of policing this protest, something in the region of £42 million.
Which is a separate question that is probably out with
but
about which...
If the organisation doesn't have the resources and doesn't, feel that it's got a right to protest, and I'm just looking at a scenario where tens of thousands of people just turn up, and the organisation said either we don't have the resources or we are not going to pay because we believe it's a fundamental right to protest. I follow the logic of what you're saying, don't get me wrong, but I'm thinking of the practicality of implementing such a proposal, because laws become discredited when they can't be implemented.
It's a valid point, and it touches on another important issue where we definitely want to avoid a situation of a two-tier system, if I can, where protests that go through official channels are, let me put it this way, that protests which choose not to follow the law in going through official channels and giving the level of notice and just effectively turn up can get away with it. And so another one of the recommendations in my review is to increase the penalties for those who choose to disregard the system and have what are effectively illegal protests. But obviously, when the police on public order grounds, when they see tens of thousands of people turning up, they will often choose to facilitate those protests. And at the moment, I believe the penalties for doing so are disproportionately low. But you are right to probe on potential difficulties in enabling this a contribution towards payments to going ahead. I would say, look, of the, well, how many are? I think it's 41, forgive me. Of the 41, is one of 41 recommendations. I would not say it is one of the central recommendations of my review. And I do believe that if this forces people to think more seriously about one of my alternative recommendations, which is to allow the police to factor in the cost of resources in making decisions on in what manner repeat protests go ahead, I hope that will have been constructive.
Before you go on, I can see there is different views from... Can we very, very briefly hear both Kirsty and Matt's very quick reviews on that? Only we've got a lot of questions to go through, but I can see you're not quite in agreement, so let's hear your views.
I cannot see how a proposal for protesters to pay is lawful, and and it shows a real misunderstanding of Articles 10 and Articles 11. Article 10.2 means that the right to protest can only be actually restricted in specific circumstances, and payment would not be one of those circumstances. And also it ignores that there's a positive right to protest that the state must facilitate. And so the proposal completely ignores it. I think misunderstands that. It's unlawful. It wouldn't get off the ground, and practically it's completely unworkable and would lead to much discrimination and the sort of issues that have already been raised by the panel.
Okay, thank you. Matt, have you got a...
I think I'm probably more instinctively supportive of what lies behind Lord Warney's proposals, but I agree with Kirsty, completely unworkable. Protester pays, I simply cannot see how that could be made to work. Even if there was a legal framework that supported it, I can't see how it could practically be made to work. allowing the police to say, effectively, we're a bit busy this month, you know, we can't have this protest, we can't accept it, it's cost us too much this month already. I'm afraid that would enable police to set the bar far too low, and effectively they'd always be able to find an excuse to not to do it. Now, you know, I agree the costs, which of course in the Met and all other police forces, they have the ability to apply for special grants to cover it. But you're right, ultimately the taxpayer is paying from a limited pot and something else suffers as a consequence. That's agreed. But I don't think the way to reset the balance is to use any of those effective banning orders or payment or billing orders that you're recommending. I just can't see how it would work.
Thank you, panel. Very interesting, food for that. We'll go back to you, Assembly Member Desai.
Thanks, Chair. So moving on, panel, the issue of resources, and if I can start off with you, Matt, and can I also say what you said earlier about the way the Met Police's public order sort of protest, I think is very commendable, and the Command and Control Centre in particular, I think is is something that I've been there for the last 7 years in the course of visiting Notting Hill Carnival, a most impressive operation. But about resources, so the Commissioner has said that additional funding the Met gets from the government in recognition of the unique challenges of policing London falls short by is around £240 million. Just policing Notting Hill Carnival every year costs the Met something in the region of £11.8 million. And I understand that policing the protests around the Middle East conflict over the last 12 months has cost the Met something in the region of £43 million with 52,000 police officer shifts. So clearly we're talking of considerable sums of money here. Should the government be allocating more money to the Met in light of increased protest activity on top of regular public order demand?
It's a perennial debate held between the Home Office, the Met, and indeed other police forces. If the figure for 43 million is correct for the last 12 months, I'm surprised it's so low. 2 protests back in October and April 20 from Extinction Rebellion, 2 protests cost the Met £37 million. So if it's 43 million for a year, I'm surprised it's not more. Bearing in mind that £37 million, taking Lord Walney's point, is twice the cost of the Violent Crime Task Force. So, these are very significant impacts. Should the Met get more? The Met already gets streams of funding that are not available to other police forces elsewhere in the country. They get a capital city grant, amongst others. The Home Office changed the rules a couple of years ago with special grants. Previously, a special grant could only be given for something that was, if you like, a one-off and somewhat unexpected. So, Champions League final in Cardiff, or I'm trying to think of the Olympics or something. The Home Office changed the rules so that sustained pressure over an extended period also qualified for special grants. So the Met has that as a route to make it. I think the perception outside London is the Met is overfunded, and if you look at per head of police officer per head of population, the Met already gets more than the rest of the country. But I was always sympathetic to the view that the unique demands on the Met actually justified that, if not a bit more on top. And I think particularly for the level of public order, protest and large event policing, that has never been adequately funded by the Home Office in comparison to the demands the Met has.
Kirsty, if I can come to you.
Well, funding is slightly outside my expertise, but I would underline that it's important not to focus on protest itself and the irritations of protest and the unruliness of it, but to look at it in the context that this is the lifeblood of a democracy that we are considering. And so funding to ensure the functioning of a democracy might be one way of considering when you're looking at police resources.
I think there are questions later on about how the demands of policing marches in central London takes the police away from the communities that they're meant to be serving. But there are
Yes.
questions later on. So we can't see protests justly in a very narrow sense and in a very abstract manner. It has implications for other sections of society as well.
Absolutely, which is why I put it in that way, that in terms of the allocation of fundings, it's not something really I can comment on.
Yeah.
Other than when you're looking at funding of facilitating protests and policing protests, then its importance really needs to be heavily underlined. But of course, there is always that removal of forces from people who are dealing on a daily basis with thefts, with shopliftings, with burglaries, and so on. And it is a difficult decision.
And finally, Lord Walney, you already given us your views, but have you got anything else to add to?
I think the only thing I'd add is, and the panellists obviously make an important point. I think I have a bit of a different perspective on the unworkability of placing a bar that allows the police to have a conversation about resources, because I think I don't think you would necessarily put it so low. And I think you might have had real experience of this. I think police leadership worked exceptionally hard in London and across the country to uphold people's right to protest. And in fact, a lot of the conversations and the controversy has been in people pushing from the outside to say, hang on, why are you allowing this activity? And they will be quite robust in saying, no, there is a right for people to protest. So I think it would be possible and appropriate to set the bar sufficiently high so that you are you are only acting when the level of drain becomes disproportionate.
Okay, thank you. We're going to have to pick up the pace a little bit here. Assemblymember Garbett wants to pick up on this.
Thank you, and thanks for your contributions so far, and I totally agree with protest being part of our democracy, because I'm very glad we don't have to work at the weekends and that women are able to vote due to protest across our country. And just to say that people are choosing to protest, but because of other routes have failed them. So, for example, when 75% of people were saying that they wanted a ceasefire, and that was a very public opinion, and our government weren't doing that. You know, people choose to protest, but because, you know, whenever the routes have failed. But my question is related to this discussion about police and police volumes, staffing protests. So organisations like Netpol have said that the police are making the choice here to police the protests at the scale that they're policing them. So I just wondered if the panel would like to discuss, or if you agree that the police could decide to police protests differently, picking up on Kirsty's points earlier about them being quick to enforce, and just wondered if there's a comment about how they maybe could choose to staff them differently. I'll maybe start with Matt and then Kirsty. Thanks.
Like you or other members have said, I never, in all these, and I got involved in this when the Home Office asked me to look at it, going back to 2020, because at that stage there was a feeling that the balance wasn't right of competing. Of course, everyone recognises there is a right to protest, but that right is not unfettered. It depends on a balance between the rights of the people who are affected by the protests. It's not just disorder, it is a balance to be struck. And I've sometimes heard the changes to legislation that have been made since, and could debate those for a session all on its own, described as an attempt to introduce a police state and eradicate protest. Nobody I've ever talked to, off the record, on the record, has ever suggested anything other than that. In 2020, the College of Policing was rewriting their guidance to police commanders. And it started by saying, in our country, we treasure the right to protest. And I remember arguing with them, and winning the argument, that treasure was too unneutral a word. And it created a mindset in which police leaders found it difficult to make that to get the balance right. It swayed it one side of the pendulum, and what we weren't looking for was the pendulum, and neither was Priti Patel or indeed Suella Braverman, who both asked me to look at this. They weren't seeking to swing the pendulum all the way down. They were seeking to nudge it back into a bit where the public was slightly more comfortable, because the public perception of what's acceptable and what's not is very different to that perhaps in this room or what you will hear in erudite panels talking about it. Public tolerance for the disruption is very low, repeatedly shown to be low. Doesn't mean the public are right. It just means that the balance needs to be, in my view, needed to be nudged back a little bit towards where the public were. All the decisions that the police are making, I don't think that there has been a fundamental change post-COVID or post-legislation. It has just it's just acted, some of the legislation has acted as a reminder to people that have to make decisions that the balance that needs to be struck might not always be in the place that the protesters think it is.
So just picking up on a few points there, I think it's a really interesting question on the amount of how policing is carried out, and I've certainly seen changes over the last couple of decades. And if I go back to the May Day riots, it was much more there that there were helicopters overhead, the technology was different, and then the evidence was accumulated by examining the footage. Now, these were riots, criminal damage. Many of those cases would have been outside any protection of Article 10 and Article 11 of freedom of expression. They are pure crimes of violence, including violence against property. Then we're now, fast forward, we're in a world where we have body cam. And that the body cams, therefore, in my view, encourages the evidence collecting being talking to the protester, and then that filming of that conversation being relied on. Now, whether that translates into having a greater number of people around a protester in order to get that footage, I don't know. However, it is a point as to whether the number of police are needed on each particular demonstration. And just going back very briefly to the payment suggestion, of course, protesters could say, we don't actually need any policing at all. There's not going to be any disturbance. We're completely peaceful. So we don't want police there, which is another reason why it shouldn't just be assumed that the police are there to stop violence. They should be there as well to facilitate and ensure that the protesters are protected. I've got a very concrete example that I referred to on Lambert Road in the summer of last year, where there was very quick enforcement, and undoubtedly that was triggered by the police having new powers under the Public Order Act 2023. The judgment in that case, the High Court judgment, is one which I'd recommend that the panel reads, because it does go back to the consideration before that legislation came in. Part of that consideration was that the legislation would lead to an increase of prosecution. So it anticipated there would be further expenditure because there would be an increase in arrests when this legislation came through. And so I disagree that arrests are in any way different or down. They have clearly been anticipated to increase by the new legislation, and that is what we've seen happening. It's a much lower enforcement bar, and the regulations that came in, which have been declared unlawful, have brought the bar of serious disruption down to more than minor. And that is one thing that this panel really needs to tackle, and it's causing a real problem for the police now, because that judgment is there. It's been there since May, and it's in absolute limbo that we have these regulations, and the police should not be arresting for protests where disruption is more than minor. They should be back to the primary legislation of serious disruption, and that's been causing a problem, and we can see those cases clogging up the courts and taking up time and expense.
I think it's worth Before going into the appropriateness of policing resources at particular events, I think it's just worth a moment on probing your assumption that our democracy doesn't work because our particular views were not followed when they were shown in an opinion poll to be in majority. I mean, you will probably know that the public opinion over very complex foreign affairs issues can fluctuate very rapidly, and it would be quite problematic for any government to base its foreign policy on what the public felt about a particular issue on a basis of an opinion poll from week to week. But presumably, if you did follow that line that we should just do what the majority want, then we would be taking a very different attitude to policing protests, because as Matt Parr pointed out, and I've done a significant amount of research and polling for my review, there is very strong intolerance of really any kind of disruptive protest, and yet as lawmakers we take a more balanced judgment, which in a representative democracy that isn't done by opinion poll from day to day, I think it's probably appropriate that we do.
Just to clarify, it was more the sense of people feeling like they've used all the traditional methods to influence decision makers and still continuing not to be heard. Example of like the Colston statue being pulled into the river in Bristol. They'd done petitions. It was more to do with using traditional methods to influence.
Yeah.
So maybe my example wasn't the best.
Understood. And it is important, and this is difficult because we live in a complex world, and there are we have millions of people with different views, and it is not always easy for people to get what they want. And one of the main conclusions from my review is that we have to be much clearer. We ought to be much clearer that actually keeping protest and objection and stating your point of view within legal parameters is really important, because there is no other way, in my view, that you can avoid ending up justifying levels of extremism, because every person who takes extreme action thinks that they have an obligation to do so, and that the normal methods of being able to change people's minds have been exhausted, and we only really have a legal framework which ought to be robust, which we should continue to debate and scrutinise. But once we justify stepping outside of that, I think we are in very dangerous territory.
Right, thank you.
Sorry, can I just add, we're talking about peaceful
Can I ask
protest?
that this is very quick, because we are really very, very over time now.
I just want to... 2 seconds. We're talking about peaceful protest, not extremism, and that's the discussion. Extremism, violence, criminal damage is likely to fall outside any protection of Article 10, Article 11. It's important that distinction's made.
Okay, thank you. Right, colleagues, we must be more succinct, and panel as well, please. Lord Bailey.
I'm going to start with Matt Parr and good morning, panel. Is the Met making appropriate use of Section 12 and Section 14 orders under the Public Order Act 1986 to manage the protests we've seen, mainly in October, around those ways?
Remind me what those provisions cover, or maybe Kirsty.
do you want to start, Kirsty? But it's basically the provision to say things about the route where people will stop, making exclusion zones, etc., etc.
Yeah, the Met has a sort of basic policy, which is the more, although it's inconvenient for the centre of London, the more protest that happens in the centre of London at the weekend is easier for them to control. If you look at, I remember sort of talking to a public order commander and saying, this is all going very well, and her response to me was, yeah, but crikey, if this was happening in Bromley, it'd be out of control by now. And that's partly because the level of experience in running protests in that central area, and frankly the level of CCTV access and no comms blind spots. So. And huge CCTV access. So their spatial awareness of something going on in central London at a weekend at a time, controlled by them, is not only it's usually what the protesters want, but it works hugely in the Met's favour because it allows them to control from a public order and public safety point of view the protest in a way that they would find much more difficult had they not put certain strictures on it. So it's not just a question of making life difficult for people that want to run protests. It's also the foundations of those decisions are very usually public order and public safety rather than any attempt to inhibit protest.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you, Kirsty, with a slight, because you'll have a different perspective, because you're representing people who want to protest. Do they feel that the Met is heavy-handed in its, or light touch in its use of those powers to suggest route to section of certain physical places, and etc.? How do they feel about that?
I'm not sure I can give an opinion on how absolutely everybody feels.
Of course.
I could say about Section 12 that it's not working, and the reason for that is because the restriction can be imposed if there may be serious public disorder, and we now have in limbo what serious public disorder means, because the regulations define serious public disorder as meaning more than minor. They came in after the Public Order Act. In fact, I think they came in before, but that's the definition, and those regulations have now been held to be unlawful by the High Court, so we're in limbo on that. The Lambeth Bridge case, which I'm just looking back at it, was on the 17th of July 2023, and there's a number of defendants still going through the court. They experienced an officer saying to them, a Section 12 condition is now applying, and there was no detail as to it. And within 15 minutes they are arrested, and they are now being prosecuted in the magistrates' courts. Many have been acquitted because they should not have been arrested in the first place. And so it's not working well, and it's given more powers to the police, which the police were not seeking in the first place. And unfortunately, when there are more powers, then inevitably they start to be used and perhaps not used appropriately. So we're seeing a lot of resources going on these cases where, in fact, prior to the Public Order Act, these types of protests would have continued without any issue at all.
But could someone suggest that there are more powers because the police need more powers, and those the uptick of arrests is what people wanted to result from those extra powers? Because we've seen lots of disruption in London. I come from a community where our children are murdered regularly. I would prefer the police were locally investigating that, not at protests that have been going on week in, week out. So the public, many people from my community, are rightly asking for the situation to be changed to draw those police elsewhere. They would feel differently to the application of these more powers. So with a different perspective, is this overuse, or is this the direction that the public are trying to tug back in?
So in relation to public opinion, consultations before these particular restrictions were brought in, certainly the police didn't ask for them, and I'm not aware of the public specifically asking for a lowering of serious disorder. The cases that you're talking about, certainly the more serious cases arising out of protests are the ones where the police had sufficient power in any event to arrest. The House of Lords, in fact, rejected the primary legislation on this, this additional... So Parliament together rejected this lower definition of serious disruption, and that's why the regulations that have come in are said to be unlawful. I'm headlining it, but that's where we are, that Parliament itself take into account representations from constituents, rejected lowering the standard for serious disruption. But of course, your point is always a significant one, and one that, of course, has to be balanced in terms of it. But protest is irritating, it's annoying, and that is actually part of it. So that also has to be worked into feedback that constituents will undoubtedly be saying to the MPs and their reaction to protest.
I'm going to move on and come to Lord Warnley. Protest isn't irritating. Protest can be, and for many communities, is downright dangerous. Irritating would suggest it's minor. I made the point about my community and our very high murder rate. For us, it's lethal, so I wouldn't use the word irritating. The Met, Lord Warnley, have been accused many times of two-tier policing following violent disorder in late July and early August. Are these accusations fair? What is the impact of these claims on individual officers on the ground?
I don't think they're fair in the way that they are being made, and there was a strong and an appropriate response from the Met and forces across the country to the very serious violence that occurred in the August riots. That was right, and I think I understand the frustration of people who have looked, for example, at the weekly marches on Gaza and seen the levels of criminality around the edges of those marches and thought that not sufficient was done on that. But there was a difference in the level of threat, in that there was a clear risk and indeed an occurrence of serious public disorder, effectively a riot that was happening in communities which saw that stronger response. Where I think I hope lawmakers will focus on is in a gap in the Public Order Act, and it's actually in section 13, not 12 or 14 of the Public Order Act, which is the section which allows the police to recommend to the Home Secretary that a march does not go ahead at a particular date and a particular time, because you will all be aware that many members of Jewish communities in London have been deeply troubled by the marches, have seen the explosion in anti-Semitism that has occurred around them, have felt uncomfortable or unsafe going into central London every week. And I've asked why the police can't give them a break and send the march, either say, no, not this week, have it every other Saturday, or go somewhere else other than central London, give central London a break. Now, the police are clear, and I think they are right in their interpretation of the law, that they are not allowed to do that at the moment, because the strengthening of the Public Order Act, which has happened in recent years, which has applied a test of cumulative disruption to conditions being placed on a march. So effectively, although the march might not reach the level of a riot, having marches week after week and the anti-Semitism is cumulative negative harm should be mitigated. Now, that can be mitigated by placing conditions on the march through sections 12 and 14, but there is no power to say, actually, don't have the march in London this week, or vary the date. The police do not have that authority, and they should have the ability to take into account cumulative disruption in making those recommendations to the Home Secretary. It's recommendation 14 of my review.
I just want to return to this idea of two-tier policing. Even in our own notes, it talked about the spreading of disinformation, and it used the word right-wing. It makes no inference to the fact that other people, left-wing, for want of a better term, spread disinformation. And is this cultural way of discussing this, misinformation, two-tier policing, however you want to name it, is it focused on one particular set of people, so therefore has some truth to it? I'll ask Matt, and then I'll come back to you.
Sure.
I'm with Lord Warney. I don't think it's a fair criticism. I was asked recently to sort of compare the way that the Southport disturbances were dealt with in comparison to what happened in Leeds, Hare Hills, a couple of days before, a week or so before. They're just from a policing point of view, they weren't comparable.
Okay.
And so to expect the same response week in, week out to different situations is very naive. However, I understand why people make the accusation. You can see how people have joined the dots and concluded that there is two-tier policing. And I go back to the first comment I made, which is that if there's something that the Met haven't done well, I don't think they've explained their actions to the public as clearly and as proactively as they could do to explain why they're doing things that might look to some people to be unbalanced with how they've treated another incident. I just want to correct where I've got my red light on. Kirsty said that the police didn't ask for a lowering of the bar on serious disturbance. They did. This is where the changes in the law were kicked off. What they didn't ask for, and what I didn't recommend in my reports, was that bar went down quite as far as it has. My preference was serious should be replaced by significant. The Home Office ended up defining serious as anything more than minor, and that, frankly, is where the trouble started. But the police were quite keen for clarity and some guidance on what serious was. What they didn't want, what they didn't expect, was what they got.
Kirsty, just before you answer, I want to come to you. Somebody wrote to me and made a complaint that people who had spread disinformation, who were perceived of right-wing, were prosecuted and ended up in jail and had community service, all the rest of that. But certain leaders of certain left-wing groups who admitted publicly that they'd spread disinformation didn't receive any police intervention at all. Is this something that you've heard, seen? Is it just hearsay? Is there any evidence that certain political views are pursued more doggedly by the law?
I think firstly on what disinformation, what crime it is that's being alleged. I'm not sure on that what the actual crime would be. Unfortunately, the social media world is full of disinformation, and undoubtedly there's huge amounts of disinformation from whatever political stripes and non-political stripes. As to the protests that I've been involved in as a barrister, they've ranged from those relating to Black Lives Matter, to those relating to Plain Stupid, to Extinction Rebellion, to people who were anti-fracking in both civil and criminal courts of appeals. So there's obviously May Day riots, which was anti-capitalism, I think, back in the day. I haven't seen evidence of particular prejudice in terms of which views are facilitated and which views aren't. And I think in that respect, generally, with lots of push and pull with the Metropolitan Police, I would say generally the police are doing a good job. And I perhaps end where I started, that it seemed much clearer pre-COVID to the police as to that point leading up to enforcement. Now there's lots of confusion. I didn't mean to say that the police had not asked for clarification of serious disorder. They asked for clarification and said it would be useful. What I said was they did not ask for additional powers policing protest, in that they said, certainly the initial consultation, that they had sufficient powers, and that was before both acts then went through.
Just briefly, Lord Bailey, I would not describe this as an issue of prejudice, but I think one of the conclusions of my review, which was to look unusually across the domestic situation, looking at the far right, but also the far left in the UK. And one of the conclusions of my review was that there is a gap in knowledge and understanding of extreme left-wing and anarchist movement, and that should be addressed within security and intelligence infrastructure because of the latent damage that it can do, that those movements can do, sometimes aided by foreign states, to our democratic systems. And I hope that's recommendation 5 of the review. I hope that they take it up. And briefly on, just further on two-tier policing, where I think there is an issue, and this is difficult for any police force to be able to overcome, but I think there can be latently a greater risk of where protesters are overwhelmingly and obviously peaceful and not in danger of spilling over into violence and public order offences, I think inevitably they can sometimes end up being treated more harshly because police officers have looked at situations in the recent past and thought, are we going to go in heavy here? And thought, well, look, if we do that, there is an aggravated risk of there is a risk of aggregating the situation and causing further disturbance, and the situation running out of control. So that basically, if you look like you're threatening to kick off, then you may end up getting away with more than if you are obviously not going to cause the police trouble, and that is a real issue.
Okay, Chair,
Thank you very much. Assemblymember McCartney.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on the issue of the two-tier policing. And Matt, you said people join the dots. And I hope you weren't thinking that they joined the dots and came to the conclusion that there was two-tier policing. Because, looking at the riots, I'm going to call them riots, that occurred after the Southport killings, we have an explanation from the Met commander, because obviously the Met were criticised for the supposed heavy-handedness with how they dealt with the Downing Street protests. But the Met Commissioner has told us that that a proactive approach to policing that violence led to 52 people being charged, with more to follow. The people involved in this are habitually violent. 2/3 of those who committed offences had a previous arrest for violence. 4 in 10 had a history of violence against women and girls. And 4 of them are known to police for child sexual abuse and exploitation. This put paid to the idea that these were decent British citizens protesting. Taking those violent people off the streets is just one aspect of the hard work officers and staff had to do over the summer. And we do know, do we not, that social media played a part in this? And I accept that many law-abiding people were caught up in these riots, but a lot of the fomenting had a background of hate, for example, EDL, and so forth. And you can, I think, just look at some of that hate in some of these riots by the fact that they targeted the most vulnerable people in asylum hostels, attempted, for example, to set fire to a hostel, in the Downing Street protest, they were throwing beer cans and bottles. So very different, I would say, backgrounds to the arrangement and the organisation of these protests.
Yes, I agree. And of course, I don't think there is intentional two-tier policing. There isn't kind of, well, we don't like those, so we're going to police the heck out of them. But these people are kind of we approve of, so we'll give them an easy ride. There is no question of that. That doesn't happen. But people could, when I said join the dots, people could look at what happened at Hare Hills, widespread damage, police vehicles torched, etc., and then say, and where were the police? They just weren't there.
Yeah.
Now, the reason they weren't there is because that happened in, I think, West Yorkshire Police, almost without notice. And I think it would have been an enormous challenge for West Yorkshire Police, which is not, it's a big force in national terms, but it's nothing like the size of the Met, to produce the resources at no notice that they needed to police that and command it would have been a huge challenge for them. So they chose to police it in a different way, to stand back, frankly. there's no way the police could have stood back for the, e.g. the Southport riots, because as you quite rightly point out, there was widespread criminality and a real threat to public order and individual safety. So it is inevitable that the police dealt with it in that way. So I agree with what Lord Wolseley said about the kind of, if you threaten that you might cause a lot of trouble, you might get people standing back. And the classic example of that is probably the Colson statue incident, where the police decided to stand back and watch it, which created some outrage, understandably. So you can see why people form the view. They form it because they don't understand the operational challenges that forces have to face. And my argument is that that's an inevitable challenge. The police should do as much as they can to explain why they're doing things differently.
And another thing, if I can just very briefly...
Can we be very quick, because we're stopping in 20 minutes, Assembly Member, whether the questions are finished or not.
Yeah, it was just very briefly, the Met Commissioner's also said that one of his prime concerns is about the serious voices who echo the accusations of two-tier policing, because they legitimise that idea. And I think in that respect he's talking perhaps to a certain MP or Elon Musk on Twitter. And I'm just wondering how difficult that is, and if there's anything that can be done about that.
It wouldn't be the first time politicians that didn't really understand what they were talking about with policing expressed an opinion.
Yeah.
Ouch. Can I say that is an important issue. I think there is also a wider issue for all of us privileged to be in positions of leadership, in being conscious of what we instinctively understand and judge in a particular way and what we don't. And by that I mean that sometimes, and I don't think this is an accusation that's levelled at the Met, but actually it can, across the political spectrum, often we understand right-wing extremism largely. We know what it looks like. We are clear we don't like it. And so we are much more comfortable, rightly, in pushing back against it. And I think there is sometimes a fear and a lack of understanding within other cultures that can mean we can end up making mistakes that we have to really guard against. I think there have been issues in recent years. For me, the question of whether the statement from the river to the sea should be illegal is difficult. I think it's certainly an extreme statement. It is deeply offensive to, I would say, the large majority of Jewish people in this country. It is really surprising that you would have someone who makes those kind of statements or chants advising a police force. And I think that decision would be much obvious and clear-cut if it were placed in a different context.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Just very briefly.
Please, because we're really running over.
Madam Chair, yes, I understand that. 2 points. What you're looking at with incendiary messaging on social media is you're looking at, can there be any enforcement against those platform providers? It's very difficult, and it's also very important, so that should continue to be looked at. Secondly, in terms of actions of setting fire, the violence, the terrible violence that we saw in those riots, they would be outside any peaceful protest protection. So you're simply looking at criminality there, and there's no issues around enforcement there with that criminality. Operationally, of course, it's up to the police at what point they make the enforcement.
Okay, thank you. I will repeat, we've got less than 15 minutes. Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you, Chair. Notting Hill Carnival. So, following the tragic deaths of 2 people at this year's carnival, what can the Mayor and the Met do to avoid such a tragic situation at future events, indeed violence of any type whatsoever? If I can start off with you, Matt, again.
I was hoping we were going to run out of time before we got to me, actually, on this subject. I find this really difficult to talk about. I think I've seen the carnival 3 or 4 times through my time as an HMI close up. It's an enormous policing challenge. And whereas it is a sort of badge of honour for police officers in public order to command a successful Notting Hill Carnival, I think it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of Met Police opinion would be that it didn't happen. That's clearly, in social cohesion terms, a really difficult question. And my conclusion is that we're probably, I won't say stuck with it, that's the wrong thing, because there's many good things about it, but from a criminality and public order thing, it's one of those things that if it hadn't been invented, if it hadn't been invented, it wouldn't be allowed, because of not so much a sort of, there's nothing cultural, even criminality in this. From a public safety point of view, it's probably the biggest headache the Met face on a regular basis, and the fact that there hasn't been some sort of mass casualty event year after year is probably only thanks to the expertise that the Met have, and frankly a bit of luck.
I'll come back to that point. That's my second question. Lord Wolseley, anything to add? No. Okay, so my second question, thank you, was actually about improving crowd safety, and in particular crushing. I'll just make 2 points here. Firstly, I think we are handicapped, Chair, by the absence of anyone from the Notting Hill Carnival Limited who were invited, but they don't even respond, because there's 2 parts to this equation: the police, but the organisers. And having been there for the last 7 years with the police to observe the policing, the lack of proper stewarding is a major factor. And in 2016, the Assembly did do a report on making Notting Hill Carnival safer and better, where we drew attention to the dangers of possible serious injuries and possibly fatalities as a result of mass crushing. Commander Musker was here about 4 years ago, and he made the point that particularly, or the year before, they had come within a whisker of having casualties and possibly fatalities as a result of crushing. And that's what the police said to us at the last police and crime committee in the form of Assistant Commissioner Matt Twist. Is there anything particular you think that the Met could do to improve crowd safety and particular issue of crushing at Carnival?
I don't know in detail. I mean, I think I've heard people suggest it should be moved outside. I think that would be politically an incredibly challenging argument to make. I think there is an argument made that the amount of criminality at the Notting Hill Carnival, even this year with fatalities, is actually not that bad compared to the general level of criminality in London, or indeed other very significant events. Not sure I buy that, but I think I've always viewed it as Matt Twist has said, the biggest worry about it is a mass casualty event caused by loss of control of enormous crowds in a very confined space. So I just think it's a headache that the Met's probably going to have to continue to live with and learn everything they can from reports like the one that you hold.
Look, I think that's right, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm not going to add.
That's why it's a shame the organisers aren't here. But
I'm not sure I can comment on the policing of Notting Hill Carnival.
Thank you. Chair,
Okay,
I'll
thank you.
just say what we said in the report. The status quo is not an option. That position still remains
you and
the
I
same.
agree with each other completely
Thank
about
you.
that. And if I could just
I wanted
say...
to just flag our report.
No, definitely.
has not yet responded to our recommendation 7 years
they
on.
should respond to that. And if I could just say that Mark Rowley actually last month said that there was a possibility of a mass fatality event. This is how serious it is. I wish we had more time, because I feel very strongly about this, as many will know. Now, in the meantime, everybody, we would like to say hello to the pupil parliament from Aldborough Primary School in Redbridge.
Hello.
You're very, very welcome. Okay, so now there's a question to Matt Parr from Assemblymember Garbett.
Thank you. Just to touch on the new legislation, I wondered, Matt, if you could speak to your views on the use of the conspiring to disrupt national infrastructure, and how we've seen that used to arrest people who are participating in workshops or planning sessions, and just particularly around environmental protest, and wondered your views on how that balances with people's right to protest.
Sorry. Yeah, this was one of the things that the Home Office discussed with us and asked us to look at. We were extremely lukewarm about specifically whether new legislation was needed covering key national infrastructure or construction. Our view was that the existing legislation allowed the police the powers, and that's where I agree with Kirsty, is that the police's view on that was they already had sufficient powers to deal with those cases. So making critical national infrastructure or building projects a sort of special case requiring special legislation was not something that I recommended back in 2022.
Thank you. And just, I know we're short on time, but Kirsty, just to speak to the conditions around, so to quote Michael Frost from the US Special Rapporteur of Environmental Defenders has expressed concerns about the overuse of bail conditions on protesters, and I just wondered if you could speak to the cost of the way some of this legislation has been used.
Yes, I remember when protesters used to be dealt with in a way where the bail would be limited. They would often be dealt with by given a bind over, which is stay out of trouble, don't reoffend in the next 12 months, and you won't have a criminal record, and then there's some protection there. And I would like to see, in terms of sentencing and enforcement, a slightly more creative approach and a return back to the way that protesters used to be dealt with. And that obviously excludes, and I really do emphasise this, that excludes those people who are not peacefully protesting. And the riots that we saw in the summer, they are not part of peaceful protest. They're outside that. We have all the powers we need for criminality, and those where there is criminality, those cases tend to be prosecuted and go through the courts. But there are many in between. People who feel very strongly about causes who are caught up and they find their lives put on hold for years now because of the backlogs in the cases. And that is destructive not only for their lives, but in fact it doesn't actually add an extra layer of protection to the public. And ultimately those types of cases tend to be found to be disproportionate interference, and ultimately there's no further action taken. So I would like to see less protesters on bail, and perhaps that goes back to, as well, less enforcement to start off with, and a return to pre-COVID policing.
Okay, Lord Bailey, very briefly, please.
This is specifically for Mel. In your 2020... Excuse me. In your 2021 HMICFIRS, you really need a snappier name for that thing, review, you wrote that the police do not strike the right balance between protecting the public and the right to protest on every occasion, and that this balance may too readily tip in favour of the protesters rather than the public. In your view, how far has the Met gone towards redressing this balance, particularly in terms of the demonstrations we have seen since the attacks in the Middle East on October 2023?
I know you're short for time. A bit. Some. And whether they've gone far enough, whether that, as I described it earlier, that pendulum has swung back too far, is really a matter of taste and opinion. But they have definitely swung a little bit. I think the other panel members will offer you views every bit as valid as mine about whether it's now in the right place or not.
Okay, I'm just going to come to you because it's directly about what you written in your report. So you think they've come back a little bit in the
Yes, I do, and I think that probably, whereas there are clear problems with the legislation, otherwise the High Court wouldn't have intervened. There was a realisation and a recognition at the time that the legislation would, however it was enacted and interpreted, it would act as a message from the government to the police that the public and the government didn't feel the balance was in the right place. So part of it was signalling to have an influence on decision-makers' mindsets, as well as being specific laws. And I also mentioned that kind of we treasure protest. Well, that was changed to we acknowledge or we recognise or something like that. So there was an attempt at the same time to change the mindset of police officers, because they simply didn't recognise that those protest rights had to be balanced with the rights of those who are affected by the protest but may have no interest in it.
Okay, thank you. Chair?
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Just wanted to bring up the 23-24 Football League season, where the Met only managed to recover about 10% of the costs of those events. What more could be done to recoup that money, and what impact would recouping that money have?
No, I'm not sure this is my bailiwick as advisor on political violence.
I mean, if the Met wanted to play hardball, they could refuse the events to take place unless people coughed up a larger amount of money. Don't forget, the vast majority of security at football matches is not done by police officers, it's done by employed stewards. So the bill for football matches has actually gone down. If you look at sort of historical levels, they cost the Met much less, and they've, as I say, transferred. But trying to get the football clubs to pay more, again, I'm not an expert in that.
And Matt, you talked there about the Met saying we won't police the event, basically. Would it ever be appropriate for the Mayor to intervene on that operation level? Matt?
Yeah, it could be. I don't see any reason why it's not. Of course, unlike the right to protest, there are no enshrined laws about the entitlement to go to a football match. So it seems to me that if they wish to ban it because football clubs were reneging on an agreement, he would have that authority, I would have thought.
Does an issue arise, though, with a political involvement of the Mayor of London in things like policing of football matches or perhaps concerts when the Mayor of London's taking freebies to go to those events?
Mayor of London is responsible as the Police and Crime Commissioner for London for oversight of the Met, and anything he wishes to discuss with the Met like that seems to me to be a perfectly valid conversation to have.
Thanks. His favourite line to us is, "I have no oversight of operational matters and I wouldn't get involved." That's his favourite line, but I will put to him your view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Right, the last question, and if we can have very brief answers, Assembly Member Hirani.
Thank you, Chair. And my question is on abstractions, because actually in the community where I represent in Brenton Harrow, it is having a major impact when people are telling me that they've called the police on a weekend and witnessing a drug deal on their street, and no one seems to be coming out to respond to it. It's having a real-life impact on communities on the ground. Just because you referred to it in some of your answers and remarks in the beginning, Lord Walmsley, about the balances and the different choices that have to be made, and you've obviously alluded to in your report as well. How can the Met reduce its reliance on abstraction and aid, and how can it lessen the impact that abstraction has on neighbourhood teams in particular?
I'm not an expert on the detail of this, but obviously the point of the pull between having to do large scale regular policing of large scale protests compared to these bread and butter issues for communities is an important factor in this, and I think there is a danger as lawmakers if we fail to understand and acknowledge just the depth of frustration that the public have with the ways in which our police force is being stretched. There are a number of causes for that, but this is one of them, and I believe it's one in which could be addressed.
Thank you. Matt?
I completely agree. It's a perennial difficult question. I don't think there's anything they can do in the short term. They can't magic up more trained officers in either public order or community work. So we're just going to have to live with it. I think that Lord Walmsley's point about the debate about at what point does this become excessive and have a disproportionate impact on all the other things a police force should do is absolutely valid. And whereas we might not agree about the way to solve it, it's an absolute debate that ought to be happening. And it doesn't, because the voices that are impacted by the sort of problems you've described are not as loud or as forceful as the people that are impacted by protest.
Thank you. Kirsty, you want to come in?
This has been a problem with the criminal justice system as a whole that I've seen collapsing over many years, and it's a wide problem. It needs urgent resources into the whole system, because even if you have some enforcement with the person who's witnessed a drug deal, or their bike has been stolen, or there's been shoplifting, even if something then happens, the chances of that case actually being heard in court in the near future is very low. And if it's serious, there's about 70,000 backlog of cases in the Crown Court. So the system itself is not functioning. There needs to be a movement so that communities are policed and protected. And there needs to be, in terms of enforcement, we are seeing far too many cases going through the courts prosecuting protesters, which years ago would not have been prosecuted. And so I'd like some review of that and some rebalancing on do police resources really need to go into prosecuting this person, whatever the other pressures around, or is this a case where, in fact, a few words of warning can be given to that protester or those protesters and resources deployed elsewhere?
Can I just quickly add to that? I agree with a significant amount of what Kirsty has said in terms of the problems that the bunging up and of the criminal justice system is causing across the piece. But where I have a different perspective is that actually the length of time that it's come to take things to prosecution for serious protest-related offences is actually has, in the recent past, meant that there has not been sufficient deterrent effect. And I think that if you... I presume, I mean, I guess this is not what Kirsty means, but I think if you are basically ram raiding into a factory and taking a sledgehammer to the roof and terrorising the people in there, that is a serious crime. And actually, there has been a problem in recent about the length of time which it is taken to get people convicted of those kind of crimes, which allows the organisers to effectively say to people who are on the edge of this kind of criminal activism, hey, you know, it'll be okay, you'll never get caught. Look, these people are still walking free and they did this, you know, three years ago. And so effective deterrent sentencing, I think, is really important on protest, but also the wider question of reversing the hollowing out of the criminal justice system, which has happened for many years, is hugely important for us as a country.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm really sorry there are questions left. May we write to you with some of the questions that we haven't had time to put to you? Can I really thank you? It's wonderful to get diverse views because we can all learn from a different point of view. So I really want to say thank you very much to our first panel of guests for attending this morning, and thank you for your answers to our questions. So we're now going to take a short break while we change our panels. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the London Assembly's Police and Crime Committee. We now continue our discussion on public order policing, and I would like to welcome our second panel of guests. So Jodie Beck from the Policy of Campaigns Officer from Liberty, Professor Jeff Pearson, Professor of Law at the University of Manchester, David Spencer, Head of Crime and Justice at the Policy Exchange, and Tom Sutherden, Programme Director of Law and Human Rights Amnesty International UK. Welcome, all of you, and thank you so much for coming. So I'm going to start with the questions. So, and this is to all of you. If I start at Jodie, ladies first, and I'll work my way down. In your opinion, how well has the Met dealt with the level of regular, large-scale protests since the 7th of October 2023? And what has it done well, and what could it do better?
Thank you. So I think from the outset, especially around October and November last year, I think what underpinned the policing of the kind of large processions throughout central London is a really troubling rhetoric from previous government ministers, particularly the previous Home Secretary, Suella Braverman. And I think that really kind of framed the way that these kind of protests were spoken about, and also placed pressure on the police to kind of take particular policing decisions. So those comments were things around hate marches, mob rule, and the policing impact is kind of emerging now in that, you know, we saw early on that the Met had to clarify what existing powers actually permit, and I think there were really good examples of where they made some really good calls and actually clarified, you know, particularly around Section 13 powers, you know, the threshold that needs to be met if a march is to be banned, when there were particular government calls to stop a march from going ahead. So I think that was a really positive example. Also kind of clarifying what is and isn't a criminal offence. And, you know, kind of if we look at the inspectorate report that came out on political impartiality just last month, that kind of said there was kind of a level of political interference into policing at that time, which undoubtedly makes policing operations difficult. The last thing just to add is that rhetoric around particular marches has not been borne out in the arrest data around these protests. You know, these are protests of hundreds of thousands of people that have gone ahead peacefully. There have been arrests, but those arrests have been very, very small. The numbers are really, really small, and the police have been using long-established public order powers to deal with those protests, rather than pulling from the more recent legislation that we've seen brought forward, which I'm sure we'll come to later on.
Okay, yes, we will indeed. And if we could just concentrate on the question, which is how well has the Met dealt with the level of regular large-scale protests? So if we can concentrate on what the Met has done. Thank you.
Generally, public order, public safety operations are very good in this country, and that includes the Met. And I think that has been reflected broadly in terms of how these large-scale protests, but other public order events, have been dealt with in the Met. I think in terms of what has been done well, these events are allowed to take place. They generally take place without major disorder. That takes some doing. Some of these events taking place, for example, in France, would not have passed off as peacefully as they have here. And I think public order commanders and advisors need to take a lot of credit for that. In terms of what could be done better, I would reflect what Jodie has said and also what Kirsty said in the previous session, which is that the messaging, the narrative from both politicians and, unfortunately, at times from some senior office, from some chief officers, and this isn't just limited to the Met, hasn't been good enough, it hasn't been precise enough, and it doesn't reflect the duties and obligations that all police forces and all police officers have in terms of human rights.
Thank you. David.
Good morning. I think, first of all, to recognise the significant challenge which these large-scale events present the Met. the Chief Inspector of Constabulary described it at some point as the brain surgery of policing, and I think that is a fair summary of just how difficult the challenge that the Met have been faced with over the last year. I think I'm the only person who's been a serving police officer on your panels this morning, so I feel qualified to say I have some sympathy for the officers that have been involved. I find it difficult to describe these, if not impossible, to describe these large-scale protests as peaceful. Huge numbers of people shouting often anti-Semitic remarks, arrests happening. It is very difficult to see how these events are peaceful. And I'm unconvinced that arrest data is the best measure of that, because, of course, predominantly that's a function of the tactical decision-making of the police. In terms of what they've done well, I would agree with the previous speaker. There has been no major disorder. There have been violent incidents, and that's obviously very difficult to deal with. But there has been no major disorder, and the public order commanders deserve significant credit for that. In terms of where things have not gone well, particularly in the early stages in October, November last year, and the Met has recognised this themselves, there should have been earlier intervention and more robust intervention to make arrests where people were clearly committing criminal offences. The Met Assistant Commissioner Twist has recognised that himself. And I think there is also a question about the public's confidence here, certainly in the research that we've done, and no doubt we'll come to this in the session. There is significant public concern about the impact of large-scale protests on the wider public. Thank you.
Yeah, and is mentioned in your, Might is right, this is your report. Matt Twist said it himself, I believe, and it's quoted in your report. Tom.
Thank you, and thank you for having me today. I will keep it brief. My points of view are pretty similar to the first two speakers. I think the police leadership certainly have done a good job in terms of the big calls that they've had to make in terms of facilitating these protests to go ahead, as is their duty under human rights legislation. I think they have done well in terms of resisting considerable political pressure on them. Obviously, as you heard in the previous session, and may well hear again today, all protests, these particularly, but all protests, are subject to significant political pushback from opponents of whatever demands protesters of the day are making. It happened that in this instance, that political pressure was coming from very senior, very influential figures, and the police did a good job in making clear the importance of their independence and the lawful basis on which they conduct themselves and their approach to policing these events. That said, I think there have been some examples around the edges of particular policing decisions in particular protests that may not have been correct. You heard some earlier on from Kirsty Brimelow. We appreciate these are difficult things to do and difficult things to get right, and it's important that we have sessions like this to interrogate those.
Thank you, and thank you all of you for listening to the previous session. It's encouraging. Tom, you've got such a lovely soft voice. Can I ask you, though, to pull your machine nearer you so that it can be picked up by the people pushing this out? So I'll start with you then, Tom, on my next questions and work my way down. How can the police judge whether a protest is peaceful, and under what circumstances should a protest or demonstration be prohibited under Section 13 of the Public Order Act?
Thank you. So the human rights framework for this gives us a relatively clear basis for determining what's peaceful and what's not, and what can be interfered with and not lawfully by the police. The starting point of this, as you know, is protest is a right, and so from there you have the right to do it unless interference with it can be justified. Peaceful protest is the action that attracts rights protection. Non-peaceful protest is outside of the legal framework that protects the human right to protest. When we talk about that, we talk about violence, we talk about serious damage to property. There are also constraints on what some people refer to as hate speech and incitement speech that constitutes incitement to criminality, violence. There is also, outside of direct criminality, there is potential to restrict speech that incites violence or incites discrimination. Those are narrowly defined, I would say. The overarching position is people have a right to do this unless high thresholds are met that can justify interfering with them. So that's, is it necessary in a democratic society to do so? And the interference that the police are permitted to engage in those circumstances needs to be proportionate. And in simple terms, what that means is the minimum necessary to achieve the protection of the rights of others or the other legitimate bases for interfering. So if we're talking about flat out banning a protest, the Section 13 power that you're referring to, it would be very unusual to be in a situation where that would be proportionate in the sense of it being the minimum necessary measure to achieve the protection of the rights of others. In the lawful framework, as we heard before in the UK, that's defined as a circumstance in which the police's Section 12 and 14 powers to impose conditions or restrictions are insufficient to prevent a risk of serious violence, essentially serious damage to property. In these instances, the police have been clear that that has not arisen, and I think that was the right decision.
Okay, thank you, David.
Conscious of time, I'll probably focus on the second part of your question.
Yeah.
In relation to Section 12 or Section 13 and then Section 12 of the Public Order Act. Certainly the view that we took when we looked into this was that there is a gap between Section 12 and Section 13, and that Section 12 conditions under the Public Order Act can be applied if there is serious public disorder, serious damage to property or serious disruption to the life of the community, whereas a prohibition can only be applied if there is serious public disorder. So you could potentially have the situation whereby you apply as many conditions as you can to avoid those situations, but it still doesn't meet the threshold of serious public disorder to be able to prohibit a march. And we think that that is a gap in the legislation which should be dealt with.
Lovely, thank you. Professor Jeff.
Yeah, Tom's answered most of the points in terms of what is and what isn't peaceful. I think the key thing to reiterate is, again, that we are talking about peaceful protest being protected here. In the first session, I heard a few references to lawful protest. We don't just protect lawful protest, we protect peaceful protest. And ultimately, the more conditions that you place upon peaceful protest and the more you look to ban peaceful protest, the more banned and prohibited protests and actions within protests will be protected by the Human Rights Act. And that's a paradox that I think the police are very, very aware of. Very quickly, in terms of what peaceful does cover, it covers a gathering in which there are some individuals that want to engage in violence and disorder. That doesn't make the entire gathering peaceful if there's just a small minority there. So essentially a non-peaceful protest is a protest which is a very qualitative rather than quantitative assessment, is by its nature violent, or one which has violent intent when it starts.
Thank you. Jodie.
Just very briefly, as points I'd make has been covered by Tom and Jeff. I think all I would add actually is that Section 13 carries a high threshold because it is really obviously significant to ban a protest altogether, and that any kind of reform to this area needs to be thought about very, very carefully because of the kind of impact and what we have seen elsewhere in public order powers in Section 12 and 14, for example, subject to legal challenge by Liberty currently, which I know we might come to later, is we've seen what happens when a threshold is lowered elsewhere in this legislation and the impact that has, and also how that disproportionately restricts protests that otherwise would not have been and would have been able to be carried out peacefully.
Thank you. Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
Support for the protests that we've had in London, when you ask the wider public, has been very, very low. I'm coming to David first, and I'll go to others after. Do you think that's because the public don't draw a clear enough line between disruption and violence? So we've talked this morning about violent protests, which is very easy to dismiss, and nobody wants that. But for the public, the disruption is very painful. Do you think that in the public consciousness there's not a big enough line? Start with David, please.
I'm not sure I can infer that necessarily from the work that we've done. Certainly what we found was that, or the specific questions that we asked were, would you be put off coming into your local town or city if a large-scale protest was happening? And we asked various scenarios, so if you were travelling with small children, if you were travelling with someone who was disabled, if you were going to visit a tourist attraction, go to a restaurant, those sorts of questions. And what we found was a pretty significant majority in each of those cases, and others as well, said they would not come into their local town or city if there was a large-scale protest going on. What was really interesting in the data, particularly interesting, was that particularly skewed to women versus men. Women were disproportionately much less likely to come in, and the same with older people as well. So what we can infer probably from that is that large-scale protests are likely to be impacting, certainly economically, on, for example, taking London as an example, on the economic impact of London. So that's probably what we can infer from the data.
Maybe I'll come to Professor Pearson, just you know, because people who are in favour of protests love them, you know, if it's their cause, you know, and if it's not, people hate them. That's pretty obvious. But we keep talking about violent protests, which is a particular thing, but disruption is largely what London's been suffering from. The protests have frankly been quite low level from a violence point of view. Do you think that the notion of disruption is powerful enough legally, and do you think the public make a distinction between the two?
I couldn't answer the second question. I'm not at all surprised with the findings of the research. I think disruptive but peaceful protest is protected under the Convention and under the Human Rights Act, so we need to take that into account. In terms of the issue about sort of majority of public opinion, again, we need to remember what human rights are for. Human rights were predominantly around protecting minorities. That was why the Convention came in after the atrocities in the Second World War. So I think we do need to be careful more generally about talking about majorities of public opinion and how much we should take that into account when we're making these kind of legislative decisions, if that answers your question.
It does, thank you. I appreciate that. Chair.
Thank you. It is, just going back to this though, it is really important, isn't it? I don't think we've ever seen such sustained demonstrations really in London, and it is having a massive impact on people's everyday life. It really is. Do you not think, I mean, in the polling that I've read in your report here, I mean, it says how badly it is affecting young people, some of these recent marches, well, for the last year, young people, old people don't want to come into London. Numerous people from the Jewish community don't want to come in near or by. So at what point do you think that their human rights, if you like, as opposed to the protesters, would surface? At what point do their thoughts and their worries become as important as the rights of those that are demonstrating?
Sorry, was that a question to me?
If you want to answer.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think this goes back to what I said a couple of questions ago, which is precision. What rights are we talking about here? I've heard rights of Londoners to go about their everyday life, rights of people to do X, Y, and Z, rights of people to make money. Well, if we actually look at the rights that are enshrined in the Human Rights Act and the Convention and other treaties, there isn't a right to go about your everyday life. We've never had constitutions and a written Bill of Rights in this country. And there is, under the Convention, a right for freedom of movement within a state, but the UK government has never signed up to that, and that goes back to 1953. So we have a piece of constitutional legislation in terms of the Human Rights Act, which essentially says these are the rights which the police under Section 6 and Section 7 of the Human Rights Act in particular need to particularly focus on. If we're talking about other rights which we want to exist, then we have to be much clearer in terms of the legislative framework in this country. And I don't think it's up to the police, well, it certainly isn't up to the police to do that.
Yeah, OK, that's interesting. Anybody else want to comment on that? Yes, Jodie.
I think it's really right to surface what the public think about protest. Public opinion is really complex on this. Liberty recently conducted some research with members of the public on where they stand with protest. This was a really long, deliberative process with members of the public with lots of different views from lots of different backgrounds. And what we actually found was there was overwhelming support for the right to protest in principle and a real desire to see that right protected. However, there are obviously concerns about disruption that need to be taken seriously. But what we found was that when members of the public were in conversation with protesters and people that were regularly going out to protest across a range of issues, their views actually shifted, and I think they moved to kind of a position of kind of having empathy, understanding, and again wanting to see the right to protest strengthened, and also tapping into the history of protest across London. And you know, London has a really rich history of protest, whether it's on, you know, universal suffrage, climate, you know, Section 28, But I think, again, just to kind of echo what Jeff was saying, protest is frustrating, it's disruptive, you know, whether it's, you know, being delayed, travelling somewhere, that is part of the core of protest, which is uncomfortable to sit with when protest is something that disrupts status quo. But when we're talking about what kind of limits need to be put on protest, at Liberty, we would argue that that balance has shifted further away from protesters, and that balance isn't quite there right at the moment.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't feel right at the moment. So the next question is, how has the new noise trigger in the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act impacted the right to protest? Do any of you have a comment on that? Tom?
I have a very limited comment, but it's quite a specific example. When this power came in, we were very concerned about it. We thought it was far too broad and open to misuse, essentially. In practice, we're yet to see, I should say, empirically, the facts of how it's playing out one way or another. The example I can give you, though, which does point to why our concerns might be valid, was that my organisation, Amnesty International, obviously we have domestic focus in the UK, but we also have an international focus. Our members are very concerned with human rights around the world. They frequently engage in protests outside embassies of foreign governments that we have found to be committing human rights abuses around the world. An incident occurred where members of ours were holding a protest outside one of those embassies, and the police went to the embassy and checked with the embassy officials whether or not the protest was being too noisy for them. Whether it was disrupting them in their work, with the strong indication that had the embassy said, yes, this is disrupting us, the protest would have been closed down. This strikes us as fundamentally unacceptable as a way of policing these things, and a very worrying indication of what the legal framework allows if the targets, the legitimate targets of a protest are to be able to determine whether or not that protest continues effectively. As it happened on that day, the embassy in question said they didn't mind, and so the protest was allowed to continue. As I say, it's a single example, and it's not something we would base a grand claim on, but it's an indication of what the current state of the law allows, and we are concerned about that.
OK. It is the case, though, isn't it? I'm sure I've read it, that when deciding on where to do these Palestinian marches, the police make sure that they do not go by the Israeli embassy. Am I right?
Yeah, it's been consistently the case that they impose a Section 12, I believe it is, condition that prevents those marches from going.
Well, I would think that was right. Do you think that's right?
Well, as I say, instances like this are very subject to the factual realities of the particular protest. We have been concerned about the use of the Section 12 powers on the Palestine protests. We haven't vocally opposed the decision to prevent them going near the embassy. We do say that, in general, embassies are legitimate places for protesters to assemble and to voice their opposition to the policies of the government that is represented by that embassy. A Section 12 restriction on that basis would need to be based on strong evidence that there really was a serious risk. I haven't seen the police rationale for that. One of the things that many of your panellists have said is that the police could do a better job of communicating the basis on which they make their decisions, and I think that's an example of where they could do a better job.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
The police's duty under Section 6 of the Human Rights Act is relatively clear. They have a duty to facilitate effective protest. And what that means in a lot of senses is that the protest should be within sight and sound of the target. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be on the doorstep of an embassy, but it does mean that if, for example, your target was the Israeli assembly, there must be some way in which you can try and get your message heard to them. Now, that may be through television, it may be through social media. So the duties on the police in that respect are quite clear. Now, to bring it back to the noise, if you were to tell a protest that it couldn't make noise that was heard effectively by anybody, the police wouldn't be doing their duty under Section 6 of the Human Rights Act. They wouldn't be facilitating effective protest.
Thank you, David.
My reflection listening to this is how sterile it all sounds. I work for an organisation that has been the target on several occasions now. And I have to say it is a deeply unpleasant experience. It is not something that we just sit through and think, oh, well, this is all fine. What's going on outside and in our office building? We have had paint thrown over our building, and the receptionist on that occasion was terrified, and that is the right word to use, terrified that the protesters were going to throw paint over her. We've had smoke bombs let off, which set the smoke alarms or the fire alarms off, which meant the building had to be evacuated. We have had the amount of noise that goes on for hours and hours prevents not just our work, but other people in the building, the cafe opposite. This is the idea that we are all just supposed to just tolerate this as the targets seems to me, whatever the legal position, which I appreciate I'm not commenting on here, seems to me absolutely remarkable. And I'd go back to the word that one of my colleagues used. She was terrified by what was happening.
Yeah, and I think we should remember that. I'm going to leave my next question because I want to make sure my colleagues all get to theirs. So I'll go now to Assembly Member Garbutt.
Thank you for your contributions, panel. So I'll be starting with Jodie and then working along. But I just wondered if you could speak to, obviously, Liberty have done a lot of work on this, but the more than minor definition of serious disruption. Should those charged under the more than minor definition of serious disruption have their charges quashed if the appeal against the regulations is successful, and why? And if you could just speak to a bit about your work you've done on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that question. The short answer to the final bit of that is yes. People who've been charged under those, under the more than minor definition should absolutely have their charges dropped. Just to speak about the case more broadly, for Liberty, this is really a case about the rule of law. It's about governments behaving responsibly and within the bounds of the law. And as I think some colleagues on the panel, the previous panel said, the passage of these regulations, which lowered the threshold for the definition of serious disruption to more than minor, they were pushed through via secondary legislation with no scrutiny after they had already been voted out in primary legislation. And it was the first time any government has ever done that, introducing something through the back door after it's already been voted out by a cross-party majority in the House of Lords. So earlier this year, the court found that the regulations were unlawful on 2 grounds. The first was that the regulations went beyond the enabling power that the Home Secretary did have to clarify the definition of serious disruption, because rather than clarifying the definition, which would maybe involve something like providing examples in the guidance of where something would meet the threshold of serious disruption, the threshold itself was lowered to more than minor. So, yeah, the regulations went beyond that enabling power. But also the second ground that we won on at that point was that the regulations are unlawful because they were pushed through as a result of an unfair and narrow consultation process. So there was a very short backdoor consultation solely with police leaders, which is obviously narrow because although the police are the people that are using these powers and enacting these powers, people are being subject to them as a result of that, and there needed to be, you know, part of a fair consultation is consulting with all affected parties. But if we kind of look at, you know, the evidence base for lowering that threshold is simply not strong enough. The policing bodies that were spoken to by the Home Secretary at the time again spoke about clarity rather than a lowering of the threshold, which it's important to separate that those are 2 very different things. But also, the regulations emerged as a result of slow-walking protests, and around the time before the regulations were introduced, if you look at any kind of Met press release at the time about, you know, them reporting the conditions that they'd imposed in slow walking protests. I have a quote here from the 156 slow marches that have taken place. 125 Section 12 conditions have been imposed. So that's before the changing of the definition. So that suggests that the existing powers under Section 12 with that definition before it was changed was actually sufficient for the police to actually impose conditions on these actions. There are also powers elsewhere that the police were using to tackle this, such as Section 7 of the Public Order Act 2023, which introduced an offence of interfering with the use or operation of key national infrastructure. So again, I think what that suggests is that there's a very, very cluttered legal landscape for the policing of protest, and actually what happens when governments reach for new tools is they're simply adding to that very complex web of legislation when there is sufficient evidence to suggest that the police are using the powers they had before.
Yeah, I've carried out research with police for over 25 years now, a lot of it embedded within police patrols and police operations. The police struggle with the amount of powers that they are given and the amount of laws that they are asked to impose. It's impossible for them to recall all of these and to be able to understand all of these in the kind of blink of an eye decision-making scenarios in which they find themselves. And I would just support from my research that it is clarity that that all the police commanders I speak to were after and are after, rather than a lowering of the threshold. In terms of the more than minor, whether is that compatible with our human rights obligations on a European level? I don't think it is. And I don't think it's compatible with the Human Rights Act, which is, after all, constitutional legislation.
Well, I'm delighted. This question gives me the opportunity to agree with Liberty and Professor Pearson, so I'm very grateful. So 2 things. First of all, the legislation. There is no doubt that the legal regime is, I think, cluttered, one of the other panel members said. And it is hugely challenging. I remember about 20 years ago when I joined the police, if you knew the Theft Act and the Offences Against the Person Act, assaults, then you probably knew about 80% of everything you were going to turn up to. And that has changed massively in the last 2 decades. So, you know, theft and assaults are less than half of what you would turn up to. So, you know, that's different to protest. But it's just an example of the legal regime, and particularly on protest, is very, very difficult to deal with. And then on the minor disruption point, our view is that certainly elements of the case that Liberty has brought is correct. As has already been said this morning, Parliament rejected this as primary legislation. The government then brought it in as secondary legislation. Our view is that that is not the right way to have gone about things. We don't necessarily agree with everything that, unsurprisingly, that Liberty has said in their case, but certainly on that core point, then we are aligned with their view entirely.
I will keep it brief because we're all in agreement on this question. I just thought I'd emphasise that what was done with those regulations is to attempt to define what the word serious disruption means. So serious disruption is the legislative standard, and then regulations like this were, at least in theory, there to give the police a better understanding of what was meant by that. What it's ended up doing is defining serious disruption in the way, and the court has found this, in a way that is not the natural and ordinary meaning of the word serious. Right? So we have a situation where a legal standard has been given a definition that is not the natural and ordinary meaning that any of us would, and certainly a police officer seeking to implement it, would naturally and ordinarily understand it to be. This is a chronic recipe for confusion. It's a chronic recipe for misuse of the powers, well-intentioned or otherwise. The court has been clear that that is the inevitable consequence of being in this situation. It needs to be resolved. I share Jeff's view that this would also separately be a breach of the human rights standards, but even without that level of protection, we're in basically a nonsensical situation that needs to be solved.
Thanks. I just have a brief follow-up just for Jodie. Just on the new legislation, I just wondered if you could speak briefly to the impact of the change that I asked earlier about the national infrastructure, so the conspiracy to disrupt infrastructure, and that we're seeing people being arrested for attending workshops and things. I just wondered if you could briefly speak to your view on that. Yeah, so whenever any offence is created, there's always the possibility of, being convicted or found in suspicion of conspiracy to commit that offence. So when we expand the category of protest-related offence, which we've seen in recent years, which includes bringing tactics that have been used throughout history into the criminal law, that inevitably has an impact on intelligence gathering. And what that means in a protest context is, are police attending organising meetings by protesters? Are calls being intercepted? And I know we've seen that in the news being spoken about much more. So I think it actually connects to our concerns about the legislation as a whole, in that what we have seen because of these new offences is a real essentially creating a hostile environment for protest, and people who organise protest and organise with community members about what the risks are to being able to organise privately, essentially, without fear of people joining that perhaps don't are there to gather intelligence. And there are a lot of learnings here, actually, particularly in the context of the Met, both from a protest context. If we think about the undercover policing inquiry that's going on at the moment, the roots of that were in activist movements, and that that needs to be watched carefully, and the learnings need to be taken from that. But also, more broadly, recent challenges to other policing practices, policing surveillance practices in recent years, like the gangs matrix, for example, which had one of the conclusions from that challenge was that there were so many young black men predominantly on there that hadn't ever committed a criminal offence but were being subject to intelligence gathering because of the setup of that matrix. So I think there are lots of really important learnings here, particularly for the Met.
Thank you. Lord Bailey, very, very briefly.
I'm going to come to you so you can jump in. And I'm going to come to the Professor as well. So you've talked about a cluttered landscape, I think legal landscape for the police. I think our former panel would agree with that. But do you think that some of this cluttering has come as a response to new protesting techniques and new levels of organisation? So you have protest groups who now have legal counsel who tell them how to cause the most disruption with the lowest legal sort of outcome, as it were, for them personally. You have protest groups who are throwing paint in some places, gluing to have new tactics. Do you think that some of this cluttering is in a response to these progressions? I'll start with if I go David and then Professor.
I suspect there are probably others who are better qualified than I to answer that. My suspicion is yes. What we see is new techniques coming out, and then the police and the law trying to catch up and respond to it. So my suspicion is yes, but there are others who are probably sort of better legally qualified to answer that. The point I did want to come back on the minor point, which Assembly Member Garbett asked, was that the current situation around the legal regime here, primary legislation turned down, secondary legislation brought in, divisional court decision as a result of Liberty's case. The police have been relying on this secondary legislation since it came in, and it's been a significant part of how they have dealt with protest over the last year and a bit. So the current situation where the police find themselves, this is hugely challenging. I was actually in Scotland Yard when the Divisional Court handed down the decision, and I can say, without going into too much detail in terms of who the people were, there was some. That poses an interesting challenge for us. Let's say this is really a very difficult situation for the Met to find themselves in. Again, a very difficult, cluttered legal regime.
So I've not been embedded in protest communities, so I can't answer this with any absolute clarity. But yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all that certain tactics, that the clutter and the new laws were a response to new tactics and new types of organisation in protest whatsoever. I think the question is whether the old laws would have been sufficient to respond to those new tactics and those new organisations. And broadly, I feel that the old laws, for example, the old laws in terms of criminal damage, the Highways Act, would have been sufficient. I don't think a lot of the new laws, there may be some exceptions, take us beyond that in terms of enabling a criminal justice response to those evolving tactics, if that makes sense.
Jodie, maybe I'll ask you the same question because you seem to have a closer relationship with the actual groups on the ground. Briefly.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would kind of gently dispute that these are new tactics. I think we've certainly seen a re-emergence of tactics that have been used throughout history. A lot of people talk about the suffragettes, that's one example, but taking locking on, for example, which is now a criminal offence, has been used repeatedly by a range of movements throughout history. And I think what is perhaps missed when when presented with seemingly a new problem, it can be very easy to resort to a new law, a new power. And I don't quite think that we've seen the thinking and maybe the evidence gathering happening before reaching for new legislation here. Good lawmaking should have that future-proofing element to it, right? And I think if we look at the origins of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act and very quickly after that, the Public Order Act, that was created in response to very specific movement groups, particularly those that are organising on the climate, and that just isn't good lawmaking. We need to do the thinking to make sure that this is not going to be disproportionately used towards one group over another, and that it won't be essentially that it won't be impacting the right to protest full stop, but actually that's what we've seen happen. And I think the last point is the origins of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, for example. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary were given some of the proposals that later made it into that Act to review. And it makes for really interesting reading, that report, because lots of police, members of the police, particularly senior police officers, really contested a lot of those proposals, particularly serious disruption prevention orders, for example, which I'm sure we'll come to. But that's not reflected in the legislative landscape now.
Okay, thank you.
We can't leave Tom out because Tom,
Tom,
you must be
Just
very quick.
Very briefly, I wanted to echo Jodie's point that I don't think it's fair to say that these are new protest tactics that's spurring this. Things like tunnelling. I was born in the early 80s, so early 90s. You'll remember the anti-road protesters. People were tunnelling, people were climbing trees. This is long-standing tactics that was the subject of political decisions to criminalise. So what was driving these new laws is less new tactics and more a political decision to take a different approach to them. Going back to something in the previous question, very briefly, I don't want to disagree with David's experience of being the subject of protest. I did want to put on record that my organisation is also regularly subject to protesters outside our offices. It is not inherent in that happening, that the kind of very difficult circumstances that David describes will always be the case and will always be the experience of their staff.
Yeah, maybe when I said new tactics, I should have talked about the scale of the tactics, the regularity of the tactics, because nothing is new under the sun normally, but it's the scale at which these things have done. I'm particularly interested in the disruption. The disruption in and of itself could be economically damaging and actually very intimidating as well. That's why I posed the question. But thank you.
I take the point. I think I would just add that often there is a demand when dealing with a new protest movement or a new social phenomenon more generally for a new law to be passed. Politicians need to be seen to be doing something, and we've had the point made that actually most of the time the pre-existing legal regime was sufficient.
Yep.
In this instance, we've now got criminal offences and other protest regulations that really cover the same ground in multiple different ways. So you have the kind of disruption that you're talking about has been criminalised or restricted
on that point,
in three or four different legal
On that
frameworks.
point, we could agree. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you, and I think we've picked that up earlier as well. Thank you. Assemblymember Roberts.
Thank you. We may have covered off a certain amount of this already, but serious disruption prevention orders, do you think that they can be effective in preventing disorder at protests and marches and rallies and such like? Anybody who wishes to have a go?
I've done absolutely loads of research on football banning orders. They were brought in the Public Order Act 1986, in fact. And they were absolutely, almost completely useless for the first 10 years of their operation because there wasn't the policing and intelligence frameworks to allow them to work. Then they started to be used rather indiscriminately and quite questionably. And I would argue that it's only in the last 10 years or so that we actually see football banning orders being quite effective and proportionate in terms of the effect they have. But that requires the UK Football Policing Unit, that requires dedicated football officers, operational football officers, absolutely loads of them across the country and at each club that are specially trained and expert in their job. SDPOs, if you read the legislation, they borrow very, very heavily from football banning orders. But ultimately they will need that framework if they are to be effective. And as far as I see it at the moment, that framework doesn't exist.
Thank you. Tom?
I thought I should make clear for those that don't know the detail of this, SDPOs, although they are enforced, the reality is they haven't yet been used, so we're speaking in hypotheticals.
Yeah.
The reason for that is that you need to have at least 2 convictions for a protest-related offence to get one. They were only brought into force in April this year, so there just hasn't been the time for people to rack up or be in the zone of potentially having one. But we may well be moving into that period shortly. We are, in principle, very concerned about them. I mean, I take Professor Pearson's point about football banning orders more generally. The underlying issue there, though, is that we're talking about the exercise of fundamental human rights in relation to protest, as opposed to the right to attend a football match. We've had some... No, you don't agree?
Sorry, very, very briefly, if I may, because this was also mentioned by Matt Parr, who said, quite correctly, there is no right to attend a football match, and there isn't. Football matches are put on by private organisations, they're not bound by the Human Rights Act. However, if a football match is prevented by a public authority, such as a police force, which said, I am not going to actually fund the officers for this to take place safely, they would have to take into account the Article 10 and Article 11 rights of the fans looking to get together. Now, that is not to say that those rights are at the same level as the Article 10 and Article 11 rights of protesters protesting against serious ecological or democratic issues. But I would push back against the idea that there are no human rights implications at all relating to football crowd gatherings. Sorry, I have interrupted you there, Tom. My apologies.
It's an interesting point. I suppose I was getting at the not the event of a football match going ahead, but a decision to ban a particular individual from participating in them. I take your point that there is a freedom of association point there, but as you say, it does not engage the same factors as a political protest situation. Because of that, because of its the importance of political protest and how highly that is protected within the human rights framework, it's very hard for us to see how an SDPO could be justified as proportionate and necessary. What they are, the scheme of the Act is quite clear that they would be used to ban somebody from participating in a protest, flat out, and also ban somebody from communicating with others using the internet, using their phone. It would require, as we've heard, very extensive surveillance powers. It would require people to hand over their phone and their WhatsApp and whatever else, or access at least to them, to the police, to either spot check or regularly check whether or not they were complying with these orders. These are all very major intrusions into very fundamental political rights that we're talking about here. So we are yet to see, but we're very concerned about how this seems structured to pan out.
Thank you. Josie.
I'll just briefly add to that. So the threshold, as Tom has said, is you have to have been convicted of 2 protest-related offences, which might read on paper as quite a high threshold, but actually because we have seen the category of protest-related offences expanded so significantly in recent years, it's actually not a very high threshold. You know, if we think about how particular offences are drafted, we've spoken a lot about the more than minor definition of serious disruption, which means effectively breaching a more than minor condition. It is really quite easy. The risk of protesters being given one of these orders is very significant, and with such a serious power that would ban named individuals from protesting and then subject them to a range of requirements, that needs to be kind of thought about really sensitively and carefully.
Thank you. David.
This isn't something that we've looked into because it's so early. I guess my only question, if 2 isn't the right number, then what is 3, 4, 10, 20, 50? Like, what is the right threshold? I realise you're the ones asking the questions.
No.
That would be my only observation.
I mean, it's the difficulty inherent in trying to enforce these orders, the fact that at a football stadium, you have a discrete and defined area which people will be in, and it's a fairly static group, and they are bound by certain behaviours. So covering of faces, for example. You won't be able to spot the people in various protests. People are not asked to give over their mobile phone details and such like. It's a different milieu from football and protests. It's a different thing entirely, surely.
To a certain extent, there is usually, well, quite often for a protest, as there is for football, there is a focal point that people are going to, but they will take a route to get there, and being on that route will often be as significant as the focal point of the protest. And at football, to just go back to my first answer, the reason that it works in terms of enforcement, whatever the questions are about the sort of human rights elements of it, is because you've got that framework in place, and you've got operational football officers and dedicated football officers who've been in post, who have considerable expertise and who know the people who are banned, and that's how it works. And I'm not sure that is in place at the moment, and particularly because with protests, you have people that maybe go along to 1 or 2 protests every 10 years. In terms of how many is enough, my concern with SDPOs is that actually the number would come down, as it did in football. You don't need to have any conviction to be given a football banning order, so the concern is it would go down.
Yeah. Okay.
Can I just briefly add that was actually the original proposal. That threshold has only been imposed because of cross-party concern that actually people who hadn't even attended a protest before could be subject to a banning order. So the model for this has actually evolved significantly already. Clearly more thought needs to be had about that.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have 3 more questions left, so I want to make sure everybody gets theirs in. So, Assembly Member Lord Bailey.
I'm going to come to Professor Pearson. Across the 23-24 Football League season, the Met was only able to recoup around 2.4 million in costs out of a total expense of 23.9 million. Should London's football clubs be making a greater contribution to policing football matches? And in addition to that, how could the Met reduce its presence at football matches and avoid public order disorder risk? And the other thing, before you answer, when people talk about this subject, do they take into account that the people attending the football match are taxpayers? So they would argue some of their taxpaying fees, and also that football is a significant contributor to our public bottom line, our public economy, in a way that maybe a protest isn't. If you, I mean, you're comparing apples and oranges here. So when you answer, could you take those into account?
Yeah. So in terms of the final point, yeah, absolutely. The tax income that's generated from football at all levels, but also not just the financial contribution to communities, but what football clubs bring to the communities is an area there's been a lot of research in terms of community identity and happiness, and that should certainly be taken into account when we have these conversations. In terms of whether football clubs in London and across the country should be paying more, there's certainly an argument that Premier League clubs in particular would be able to find money somewhere if they shifted things around, given a few years, to make that contribution. The concern from the English Football League, and I think it's a valid one, is that actually Football League clubs are very much, if they are breaking even, then they are doing a very good job, and additional pressures in terms of having to pay for police, which they would say, well, some of this is already coming out, we're paying in taxes, may well drive some clubs to the wall. In terms of your middle question, which was how potentially can the Metropolitan Police maybe not spend as much money, I mean, I think that this is something that we've been looking into for the last 10, 15, 20 years. And ultimately, more police officers in football doesn't tend to mean more effective football operations in terms of public order. What we tend to see in terms of how football is traditionally policed is that we will have PSUs, so 3 serials of officers in 3 vans that will be that will stand around in groups, essentially acting as a deterrent or waiting to react to disorder. Now, there is a project which is going on nationally, but also in the Met, called the Enable Project. And at Brentford last season, the dedicated football officer there bought in heavily to this, and for 16 matches of the season, they trialled a new system that instead of bringing in public order trained officers from these PSU units, they would have a single PSU unit when they could, which was made up of operational football officers. So officers that were specifically trained in managing football crowds and in terms of identifying risk, but also being proactive. And what they found was that, first of all, over those 16 matches, they were able to prevent the unnecessary extraction of 499 officers. That was a figure I was given, so if it's wrong, please don't blame me, over those 16 matches. So those were officers which, to bring your point in the previous session, could have been investigating murders, meant they could stay in their normal jobs. In terms of the outcomes, there was no increase in public order, but there was an increase in terms of crime detections at those matches, which indicated that the officers were doing more. So actually the taxpayer was getting more for less. That project is ongoing. It is being rolled out at different clubs in London, and there is an invitation subject to the DFO at that operation accepting it if any member of the London Assembly would like to attend and see how that potentially works. That offer is out there. I'm passing that on. That's not my offer.
Thank you. I think that's a very comprehensive answer to my question. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. I wanted to ask questions in relation to the powers for stop and search for objects related to protest without suspicion, and perhaps start with you, Jodie, and think whether that is a good power and for the police to be able to use.
Thank you for that question. So we at Liberty, we oppose the use of stop and search in a protest-specific context, and when these powers were being introduced into Parliament, we worked with parliamentarians to amend the Act so they didn't feature. We were obviously unsuccessful. They came into force last December. The data that we have so far, which is limited, so current stop and search data only runs up until the end of March this year, shows that these powers aren't being used very much at all at the moment. So there were only 35 individual suspicion-based searches for items related to protest in that period between December and March 2024. And I think one of the main issues with using stop and search in this context is because the prohibited items list for a protest-related offence is never-ending, so that could include a whole host of very innocuous objects. And what we've seen to date, actually, is where that power has been used, it's captured people who were going to protest peacefully. It's captured people who were just going about their daily lives. So we can look at, for example, arrests at Royal Ascot for carrying nail glue. Again, just showing that a range of everyday items are being captured in this list. But I'd also kind of question if this is in line with the Met strategy at the moment. You know, we've seen this new Met for London plan come forward, and part of that is taking a more precise approach to the use of stop and search. And this never-ending list of prohibited objects in a protest-related context doesn't lend itself to precision, because it concerns things that we might well be carrying unrelated to protest. It concerns things that kind of tie that you would use to keep your placards together if you are going protesting. So I'd really query the use of that power at all. And just lastly, this was perhaps one of the parts of the recent legislation that received the most opposition from across all corners of politics. You know, we had ex-Prime Minister Theresa May coming out and saying, look, we need to think very carefully about expanding stop and search in this context. We had a range of former chief police officers kind of saying the same. And so, yeah, it's certainly a real big area of concern for us at Liberty.
Thanks. You did start by saying there's only been 35 cases, so would that show that it isn't being used over exuberantly by police?
I would think about it, I would characterise that a little bit differently. I think I would, the way that I would view a low use of the power is that there isn't sufficient reason for it to exist. And I think in the context of, you know, as many people on the panel have said, a very cluttered legislative landscape for protest, that's even more troubling, because there are just the sheer amount of powers that the police can use in a protest context means that we should really deeply question whether we need more. And kind of, I certainly think that, yeah, Liberty absolutely has concerns about stop and search across the board, but to kind of keep it in the protest context, the police can use stop and search for other reasons if it meets the kind of, you know, the criteria for using it, if there's suspicion of serious violence, for example. So that power is still there. We just certainly don't believe it should be extended to a protest-specific context.
Thanks. Does anybody else on the panel want to come in on it?
Briefly.
Just very briefly, I would echo everything Jodie said. I think from our perspective, this goes back to this underlying point about protest and the attitude to protest as opposed to other things. Suspicionless stop and search is, as this panel I'm sure is very aware, is a very controversial power. It's subject to lots of concern across society, and I'm sure this panel has dealt with that over the years. The justification for it is that it's used in the context of a risk of very serious violence. Now that is, whatever else you may think about suspicionless stop and search, that's the bar on which it can be justified. That is no longer the case, because except when it comes to protest, because protest has become the only scenario outside of very serious violence where the police can now use suspicionless stop and search. And we say that that's the wrong approach to the legal framework around protest itself.
Thanks. And Jodie, I just had one follow-up, if that's okay, because one thing that plays on my mind throughout this discussion, especially from hearing yourself and perhaps Tom to a degree, is when you're talking about protecting the right of protest and protest, do you see it through the prism of all protest? Because it's very easy, I think, to talk about certain protests, but the police have to be apolitical. So, for example, this October, Tommy Robinson will be holding a march in London. For example, we have anti-abortion protests. Now, when it comes to police, it is up to them to treat all protests fairly and justly and have an apolitical stance on that. Is that the prism through which you are talking about these rights and the research you talked about, is that the prism through which you see that?
In the research we conducted, we spoke about a range of... In fact, we didn't even present a particular case. It was the people involved in those groups that brought a range of issues that they wanted to protest about, whether it was climate, whether it was attending a Palestine Solidarity March, whether it was a myriad of issues. We certainly work across a range of issues. I can't say that we would be commenting substantively on the contents of a range of protests, but for us, the overarching point is the right to protest should be protected, and I think we'd certainly also take the view that some protests have been policed in a different way to others, or rather rhetoric surrounding particular protests has shaped the policing approach to those protests as well. So I think it is a slightly different picture.
I think, if I may, very quickly, just to add to that, this is one of the problems that we have in terms of just viewing this through the lens of protest rather than viewing it through the lens of peaceful assembly, because we get into situations where we have, for example, the Sarah Everard vigil, which was not meant to be a protest, was but still had those human rights protections. Gatherings for the Queen's funeral cortege, the Notting Hill Carnival. These all trigger, to varying extents, Article 11 protections in terms of peaceful assembly. And we start to get into trouble when we try and pick out protests from the others. And if I can give a very quick example, football officers trying to deal with fans that are marching to the ground, setting off pyrotechnics. If part of that march is a protest, for example, against ticket prices, and they set off that pyrotechnic, they can be arrested under protest legislation. But if they just set it off because they're going to the football match, they can't be arrested. That's when if the legislation comes through. And that's really challenging for public order officers that have to do, of course, this range of events.
Okay, thank you very much. Last but by no means least, we have Assembly Member McCartney, but we have only 5 minutes, so can we bear that in mind? Thank you.
I will do. Thank you. Section 11 of the Public Order Act 1986 says that the police should be given 6 clear days' notice of any intended protest. Can I ask, is that working well? Or has there been any arguments put forward about extending that notice so the Met or the police forces can better arrange their resources, for example? Or is that not something that you've discussed? I'm just going to start with Tom and work down the panel if I can.
Given that we've got 5 minutes, we've got a limited answer to this. So that relates specifically to marches, I would say, and I would also highlight that it only applies to the extent that it's reasonably possible to give that kind of notice. So it does allow for what's referred to as spontaneous assemblies from time to time. We say that that's an important distinction to make. Without that, you're in a situation where you have essentially the legal framework being that the police are able to give permission or not for a public demonstration, and the human rights framework is structured that you have the right to do it subject to lawful and proportionate restrictions and so on. So the arrangements as they currently stand seem to us, broadly speaking, acceptable on that front. I'm aware, I'm sure David will be about to tell you about, there are ideas around there for extending that, and we do not support those ideas.
Thank you. David.
Not wishing to be entirely predictable, Tom is entirely correct. So we recommended that England and Wales should replicate what happens in Northern Ireland, which is rather than 6 days, it's 28 days. And the basis for that is the amount of work that is necessary to happen within policing and elsewhere to be able to put the resourcing together without substantially negatively impacting policing, for example, in the rest of London, in your constituencies, is substantial, and 6 days just isn't enough to do that.
There will be some protests which 28 days or longer, or even 2 weeks isn't, that opportunity may have gone. So that's something to take into account. In terms of how it works at the moment, generally I think it works well, and it might even work well in terms of the 28-day proposal, as long as Gold Commanders have the independence to be able to do that human rights balancing act. And I think that's one of the reasons it has to date worked well, is that they've done that proportionate response in terms of not banning marchers willy-nilly. So I think that's something positive. My concern is when you start to have political pressure upon commanders that are making those decisions, and of course the longer they have to make those decisions and put that in place, I think the higher the risks are that we won't get a proportionate human rights decision.
Thank you. Jodie.
I would just echo the comments made by Tom. At Liberty, we wouldn't support the extension of that time period. It's really important to protect the right to assemble spontaneously.
Sorry, apologies. To come back on the Northern Ireland comparison, it's important to understand that what we're talking about here is an interference with protest rights that could potentially be justified, and the particular circumstances of Northern Ireland are such, when we're talking about marches, are such that the framework that has been put in place there is, broadly speaking, in compliance with human rights obligations. That's in the very particular set of circumstances that does not pertain in London, does not pertain in England and Wales more generally.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
It's very difficult, isn't it? Because public will say that they have got human rights, and we've heard what you've all said today, and it would appear it's not quite as simple as that. But I hear all the time people feel that they can't come into London for various protests. But thank you so much. This panel and the panel before, I think my colleagues will all agree it's been so informative. So we're really grateful for your time. Thank you. So thank you, guests, for attending this morning and for your answers to all our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion? And can we also delegate authority to me as chairman in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the meeting? Okay. Thank you. Can we agree the GLA guidance for the handling of complaints and conduct matters with one amendment to paragraph 39 to take effect immediately? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme for the 24-25 Assembly year? Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on Wednesday, the 23rd of October at 10 a.m. in the Chambers City Hall. Now, I have no urgent business, but before we close today's meeting, on behalf of the committee, I would like to thank Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, Sophie Linden. She's announced that she will be moving on from that role on the 18th of October. Sophie, whether we ever agreed with her or not agreed with her, she has been exceptionally good on coming and answering our questions. For that, we most certainly thank her, and we wish her well for her future. On that note, we will end the meeting. Thank you.
Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by. This is the broadcast from City Hall, the home of the Greater London Authority. Please stand by.